Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation and that introduction. So, yeah, I'm going to talk to you about my experiences of working with artificial intelligence and trying to apply that into a laboratory practice in an area that I'm working in. And yes, I have had experience, but by no means am I an expert on AI. And I think this is where I'm going to be posing questions around what we should be doing as a profession and what we need to look at and the questions we need to and the answers we need to develop to the questions that I'm going to pose today. So I'm just going to introduce you, if I can just get my screen to move. Hold on. There you go. So just to introduce what we do at the Bowel Cancer Screening Hub in the Midlands, we're one of 5 national hubs. We invite over 1.6 million subjects to participate in bowel cancer screening. And we invite subjects between the ages of 54 and 74 to do fecal immunochemical testing, looking for blood in fecal samples. But we are rolling that out to a younger cohort. We cover individually about 15 screening centres, and we organise all the analysis of the tests and arrange all the appointments. And we have our own packing room and helpline. So this is just to give you a background of the area that I work in, and therefore where you can start thinking about applying maybe AI. And it's interesting about the clinical scenarios you need to think about. So I'm going to go straight into it. We were approached by an AI company, Advanced Expert Systems, to be co-applicants on an Innovate UK grant application to develop artificial intelligence and machine learning system to improve bowel cancer detection and reduce unnecessary colonoscopies. So the question is, and when you come to look at AI machine learning and in any clinical area in which you want to apply a new technique or a new test, why? What's the clinical background? What's the clinical need to do this piece of work? So we know that bowel cancer is the 4th most common cancer in the UK. We have over 42,000 cases of bowel cancer diagnosed each year. And of those, over 16,000 lead to deaths occur to related to bowel cancer. What we do know with any other cancer is early detection leads to better clinical outcomes. And unfortunately, high numbers of colonoscopies do not show any pathology. So, and we know colonoscopies are very resource intensive and quite expensive. So you need to use those resources carefully. And why do we need to do that? Again, what's the clinical reason to do screening? If we look at this diagram and we look at the epithelium of the bowel, as people develop and we go from a normal epithelium to polyps to carcinoma, screening and early detection and removal of polyps that are precancerous leads to prevention and better outcomes in patients. So I'm just trying to describe the clinical scenario in which we are working. So that's the clinical scenario, just to describe what's happening. But one of the things you have to start thinking about, and we had to consider when we were speaking to the company AES, is they talked about artificial intelligence and machine learning equivocally in terms of just shifting between on the other, but they're actually 2 different things. Now, in definition terms, artificial intelligence, and by the way, there are many different definitions and nobody's pinned down the exact the perfect example to describe this, is an ability for a system to carry out tasks that humans currently do in a smart way, okay, leading to more efficiencies. Machine learning is a subset of AI, where the system is given data and it learns for itself and it's continuously learning. So if I was to think about this a different way, if you were to give an artificial intelligence system, a software, the descriptions of how to produce a bookshelf, it would be very strict instructions on how it would get from step 1 to the last step. However, in machine learning, you would be thinking about how you would teach somebody how to swim. You can tell them how the technique of learning how to swim, but they have to get into the water and learn and adapt. And there's a difference. Artificial intelligence is more like algorithmic based stuff. Machine learning is where the exciting stuff really is and the really powerful things are. But it comes with positive and negatives around that. So once you understand that different concepts, you can start thinking about how you can apply it in your area. So our project was called ColonSys. And what was the aim? We were to take data, age, gender, the fit results, the deprivation score, that's what IMD stands for, and look at the trend in concentration of fit results. And that's collected in a bowel cancer screening software and develop an AI. At the moment, we just have a cut-off, so anything below 120, we would never won't refer for further tests. Above 120, we would do further investigations. So it's very a black, very clean cut-off. But what we know is that actually it's actually more nuanced than that. So what we wanted to move to was a 3-risk stratification or a 5-risk stratification. And the aim was to reduce the number of colonoscopies for those who had no findings, for those where the FIT results were falsely positive. We also wanted to improve bowel cancer detection, looking for those people that had higher risk and therefore more likely to have cancer. So looking for more improving the true positives. We certainly needed to show full clinical validation from this work and aim to make it part of the current screening pathway with interoperability with current IT systems. And importantly, it does need full regulatory approval. Now, when it comes to AI and machine learning development, you as a laboratory, all of us as individual laboratories, may be approached at different times in the development of that software. It may be right at the beginning when you have a concept only, which is where we were approached, that somebody had an idea, we had a clinical scenario, would you like to develop that technology? Great. However, you might be at a point where somebody is already coming to you with a product, an AI machine learning product that they've already developed, and they said, well, can you please run this in your population? We need to clinically validate it. In which case, you're not involved in the development of the product. You're talking about the clinical application. Or you might be in the third scenario where the product has been developed, already being validated in another site, published, hopefully, and peer reviewed, and they're asking you to roll it out because it successfully happened in another site and therefore they want you to come get involved. But that comes with different, at each stage, those comes with different challenges to you as a laboratory. The first thing you have to make sure you do is get into some contractual agreements. And that's really, really important because you've got to remember you are experts in your field. AI experts here who can develop the product need you and your data here in order to combine it to make a product that they are going to commercialize, and therefore you have some level of intellectual property rights. So it was interesting as we were speaking to AES, we had to sit in a meeting with our contractual team talking about who owned what, because they can't do it without us. And they can't do it without, so we can't do it without them because they have this expertise. But you need to understand who owns what and who owns the outcomes, because for us, though we might not need to know how they've developed it, because don't forget it's their intellectual property rights to and commercial secrets that they want to keep, which is an interesting debate around the ethics around this. But we certainly wanted to publish the outcomes, who own the output of this new piece of information and data coming out. So I think if you are approaching, you'd ask to get involved, you've got to know your value in what you're inputting into the development of these products and the fact that you're providing this data. So we had to have those conversations, which was a very unusual place to be because we're not usually having those conversations. Now, one of the things you have to really think about as you come into this, and we had to think about carefully, is this work ethically permissible? We need to make sure we have all the consents in place. It's people's data. There has to be transparency, and that's really, really important, because if I looking at this slide, we sometimes don't know how the machine learning algorithms and potentially AI are getting to the output. And we know that we work in a scientific field where we have to explain everything. It has to be able to be replicated. We have to be able to show that it's safe, and everybody should be able to do the same. Now, that's a debate we ended up having with the company. And how do you meet the scientific burden of proving the outcome of the AI without compromising a company's ability to run their business? There has to be fairness around who's included. You don't want to exclude certain populations and exacerbate health inequalities. There has to be accountability. Who takes responsibility for the decisions that come from the decisions made by an AI machine learning product? We know where we sit. If we validate something, or we add a comment or give clinical advice, our names are next to it. What do you do when it's coming through a machine learning algorithm? We have to consider sustainability. There is enough evidence to show that developing AI is not environmentally friendly. Just to train an AI, and that's not even before you run it, it's been shown that you produce enough carbon as much as 5 cars in our entire lifetime. It is not environmentally friendly, so you've got to be careful about that. And the more powerful these particular products become, the more unsustainable they become. So you've got to think about the safety of the data, the security and the accuracy. So as we came to do this piece of work, and after we considered all these things to make sure we were doing the right thing based on all of those things, and working our way through the process with the company, we had to start thinking about our data. Now, just to give you some background, if you're going to be working in AI and machine learning development, there's different types of data that you get involved with that helps you train your AI or your machine learning algorithm. First is supervised learning, in which case you have data that has very clear um, um, description of the categories of outcomes of that data. So it's clearly labeled data. You know what the input of data is and you know what the outcome. So you have your clinical diagnosis. This is a true positive, true negative, and you just populate that all into the algorithm and you make it learn. Unsupervised learning is a bit more that happens. It's something that happens more with machine learning. You just throw all the data into the algorithm or the machine learning software, and it learns for itself. Now, you can then move on to the third one, which is supervised learning, to unsupervised learning or reinforced learning. So you let it learn, you let it go, then you just run some data through it, and then you try and learn from it again. Now, there are lots of different models that underpin all of this. I'm not going to go in through them because they're actually talks in their own right, but it's just something you need to be aware of, because you have to understand how you are training your AI. And when I say training, you are providing it with data that you have clearly distinctly marked or not or labeled as producing a certain outcome, particularly in supervised learning. And it's very important to know that. Now, I'm not going to go through this for this entire slide. What I would say is, in the UK, it's certainly the process of getting data and the governance around getting data is very onerous. We had to complete all this paperwork to get the information we needed. And I think that's really important. The governance has to be really secure so that you are getting data that's going to be safe and secure. It protects the confidentiality of your subjects, but it doesn't compromise their care. So it's just to give you an example of some of the things that we found and the challenges we faced is getting the right data and going through the right approvals. Now, as you come into using data for AI, you've got to start really thinking about what you are putting into it. It definitely has to be high data quality. The data size has to be statistically calculated. We should all be familiar with that anyway. You use too small a population, you're going to underpower your analysis, and therefore you're not going to find significance. You use too much data, you're going to start making over calculating statistical significance, and therefore making links that aren't there. So you have to do a power study. And interestingly enough, we did a first study pre this one, where we had a smaller subset and we found no statistical significant outcome, and that's because we underpowered it. So that was some learning from us. So definitely do a power study, and then we've moved on to get more data. You do need to make sure your data is suitably cleaned. You have to think about your data inclusivity. You don't want to exclude anyone, and you have to think about your health inequalities. Because if that data does not include your entire population, you may be perpetuating it with your actual AI that you are developing. Data has to be based on the population that AI is applied to. There is enough evidence out there on publications that certain AI developments, once they've been rolled out, haven't worked the way they expected because the training data has not reflected the population it's based on that you're going to roll it out on. So you've got to be really clear. You want to make sure it's unbiased as possible. And also, importantly, you've got to be clear. You cannot take data generated by an AI ML model and pump it back into itself, because it will lead to model collapse. You need fresh data coming through. You cannot use that data that's been produced as an outcome and push it back in. It will just not work. It will lose all of its power. And you've got to be aware there may be a gap between the data used for the AI training and then the final launch. And that's just reflecting again, the population which you train on may not be the population you finally end up launching to as a product. So knowing what we know and knowing what we saw about the data that we need, I had to think about what are the limitations of the data that we're using in our in our AI development? Well, first of all, we invite people every 2 years. Okay. We record that in our same database. However, what we don't capture is what we call interval cancers. So those are patients that will end up developing cancer between our screening invitations, because that information sits on a separate database, which we would have to go through a completely different process to obtain. So there's a major gap there. We're not really seeing our true negatives there. I'm sorry, our false negatives there. So that's going to skew our data and the way our AI works. We don't have any data on those not participating in the bowel cancer screening. So those people that are just not getting involved. So those are going to be people from ethnic minority groups, those with learning disabilities, and those are from poorer social economic backgrounds. And all of those have been proven to have higher risk of bowel cancer than the general population. And yet they're not in our data, because if they're not participating, we don't have that information. And at the beginning, I talked about the change in the age of participation. And we know that incidence and prevalence changes as you move down that age group. So the data we're using now, which is historic, is, like I said, that's going to be very different from the population we end up applying it to, because that age group is going down. At the same time, we're also changing our fit cutoff. We use 120 at the moment in England. We are shifting to 80, but all our data we've collected historically has been based around that 120. So we need to start thinking, what does that mean? We're going to get a lot more false positives because with lowering that threshold. What does that mean for your AI? So you have to be very careful of the fact that you've got an AI. You can't just, you've got the data, you've inputted, done all that work. Things are changing. You need to know where the gaps are so you're not perpetuating some of these issues. Now, in UK, in England, we have started setting up something called secure data environments, and there's about 12 of them. This is a new piece of work that's been done by NHS England, and it's to ensure the safety of the data. So I'm not going to go through this in too much detail. What is clear that as the NHS in England, we give away a lot of data that people want to use to develop and do research. However, that requires that people are securely keeping that data safely. They're not sharing that data, and they're deleting it as appropriate. And because it was that kind of self-certification, and there was a backlash or concerns from the public about how their data was being used, these secure data environments have come into being. And what it is recognized is that what we will do is have these secure data environments where if you want to develop an AI machine learning software, you apply to approach the secure data environment, you pass your product through a firewall, develop your product with the data in the secure data environment. You can withdraw your product, but your data stays where it is. So you do not have access to it. You cannot share it. You cannot take it away from that environment, because what's been recognized is that at the moment we give it away for free. It's a commodity is what they recognize, and we have to have patient consent to be able to just provide that data. So we will be charging for access to that data, but it also protects it and the public confidence that their data is being used securely. So this is all coming into being. So this has shifted for us because we were applying for it very differently. We didn't have to do it in a secure data environment, luckily for us, but that is changing now. All our new applications have to go through this process. So going back to our project. So for colon cysts, we had to really plan what we were going to do. Now, this is a very busy slide, so I'm going to go through it bit by bit. When we came to look at what we were going to do in terms of clinically validating colon cysts, we had to think about it in very different stages. And this is there's enough out there to show that these are the processes that you have to follow. We had meetings with NHS England who told us what the clinical burden of proof was, that it was working the way we wanted to do. So right at the beginning, you have the feasibility and conception, which is where we started. And under that, you have to define your protocol for your study, your ethics. You have to get your data and introduce statistical outcome. But that goes then to training and validation. As you can see, the arrow moves backwards and forwards. Because as you develop it, and you might find that it isn't working the way you think, you have to go back and start doing further development, because you cannot keep going forward until you know it works the way you expect it to. You go through each stage, making sure you've got full ethics and statistical analysis, and then you move on to what we call a silent study. So in a silent study, you would run your machine learning AI product alongside the current clinical pathway with no intervention. And that's just to see whether what you're producing as an outcome matches standard practice, and then you would review it. That would then move on to a randomized control trial. So, in which case, you are now intervening down different pathways and doing a comparison to full implementation. Again, full ethics, full statistical analysis, and making sure that you have complete sign off from all regulators. So, you do need to go through and make sure you have regulatory approval, interoperability, and user interface. Importantly, there has to be patient buy-in that they will be assessed against risk stratification and not just against the cut-off. So it really is important we have engagement from all stakeholders. So one of the biggest issues we faced as we came to do this research was a huge delay in data for coloncysts. And I talked about that gap as well as compounding issues of reducing the age of screening program and the cut-off. We asked for data in 2021. We didn't get the data until 2024 when some of our funding had already gone, it had already been finished. So, you have to be aware that one of the bigger problems that people are facing across the board is getting access to adequate amounts of data. So we have now 1.7 million patient records to do this development work because the data we had before was too small, but that is the kind of volume of data you're looking to really validate large AI programs in, sometimes even more. Okay, so just to give you, so this is just to punctuate some of the issues that we faced as we came to do this piece of work. And then the other issues that we came across, and that was quite interesting with the regulations, because suddenly we work in an environment where we're not used to working. I personally am not. You usually have companies that manufacturers that do all that in terms of diagnostics. So in UK, there was an AI and digital regulation service. So that's been set up between 4 organisations: NICE, MHRA, HRA, and CQC. I'm not going to mention what they do. There's lots of documentation on their website, but it's been used, and collectively they're trying to describe the framework in which AI can be safely implemented into clinical practice. And I'll be honest, it shifts quite quickly. There's things that suddenly become old news, and there's things changing because the regulatory landscape is changing faster than we can keep up. But then AI is going even faster than that. So we're not sure it doesn't seem to be quite in sync and bottomed out just yet. So what are the regulatory considerations we need to start thinking about? Well, interestingly, the manufacturer, where designing and developing a product, needs to think about their regulatory approval. And funnily enough, this is where we found ourselves because we were with the company manufacturing the product. We're not used to working here. We're usually here in the middle with a company coming along and saying, I've got this reagent that can measure whatever test, test X, and it has this CV, its bias is this, and clinically it does this. Suddenly we were here talking about different kind of regulatory approvals, and I'll go through what we experienced as we went through it. As a healthcare provider, you need to be aware of your regulatory considerations, and even then we still don't know what that is. We're still trying to work that through. And then the regulators themselves have to come in and do it, but even we don't know what standards they are measuring themselves us against, because there's so many out there, and I'll go through a few of them. And all the way through this, you have to think about the ethical, social, and clinical implications. You have to think about the ethics of how you're doing it, and the clinical impact, and the social impact. There's enough evidence there that if you trust AI machine learning too much, you lose the ability to know when it's not right. And sometimes you can't always trust everything that you get because if something's not been set up properly. And this is where we have to be really careful about how we monitor the quality and the clinical governance of these systems. So in England, we have very clear guidelines and regulations for the manufacturer. There's something called DTAC with clinical safety on DCB 129 with all these implications thought about. As a health organisation, we need to implement regulation. And then obviously, as I said, the regulator themselves has to think about how they're going to come in and assess us. And I'm not going to talk about this, but all of it is based around risk assessments. So what we had to do was start thinking to comply with it. And this is where we ended up on calls with the company AS. We had to develop a clinical safety plan. We had to do a hazard log for clinical risk to work out what would you do if your AI algorithm gave the wrong result? How would we manage it? and we had to provide a clinical safety case. So these are the kind of, this is not the so interesting, the interesting stuff you do with the AI. You think you're going to do this fantastic AI project and you're going to go and apply it and it's going to be great. Suddenly you're bogged down with forms and more bureaucracy of how you have to meet the clinical safety. Very important, but it is hard work and you still have to get involved. Now, what are the standards that you have to apply for? Now, there's nothing mandatory around any of these standards, but there are plenty out there. There's not even all of them. I just did a quick Google search on all the different kind of ISO standards that are around artificial intelligence. And we also had to assess the company we were involved with, make sure that they were working to a higher quality. So, for instance, they didn't work to ISO 9001 for quality management systems, but there are all these other ones that have come through now. Cybersecurity, environmental management systems, which we already talked about, business continuity, risk management, how do we use machine learning, and a cyber essential certification. If you are approached by a company that wants to do this work, you also have to have assurances that they are working to the levels of standard that they should be. Nothing is mandatory, but you've got to be aware of it. Okay. So importantly, this is where it was more interesting because I had to start thinking very differently. Well, how do I, or we as a group, provide evidence of the clinical effectiveness and quality assurance? We hadn't got as far as doing some of the work yet because we just had the data. But what tools and what techniques are we going to use to really assess whether that piece of product that you've just spent time developing, and it takes a long time, is really working the way it should? Now, just to touch on these, because you just need to be aware of them, but you don't have to. I'm not going to go through them. What has become clear through all the publications that are out there on PubMed and various other sites, there has not been a proper standard way of publishing AI in terms of the way we do for other scientific papers. And what's happened is that because the information is poor or not very well explained, as people to go try to use that AI in their population, it doesn't work the way it has done in the publication. So that there has been a real drive to develop standard protocols and how you publish your AI outcomes. So, or how you can clinically show what, in terms of peer review papers, the level of quality that you must be reporting to ensure that it's of the highest quality. So, and these are all for the different types of products you would be doing. I'll be looking at tripod machine learning because that's one that's most appropriate for what we're doing, which is about risk stratification. So, as I was pondering how we were going to manage this, knowing what we know about AI and what we know about machine learning, which is two different things, how do we ensure the ongoing quality assurance of AI and its development? So, this is my concept, and doesn't mean it's the only concept, but in my view, you could develop an AI, but then you keep it static, and the company we work with agreed it should be static, it cannot change. You would assess the accuracy, precision, your sensitivity, specificity, and accepted for clinical use. It's implemented. In the meantime, you have new data still being input in so that you can develop it further. You then launch your AI version 2 with all the same parameters considered, and then implement it, hopefully better than the version before. Okay. And you would go on to do version 3, etc. And in my mind, it was like, well, we do a similar concept for verifying and validating new reagent formulations. So this is not new concepts. It's just us working through how can we apply what we already know to something that's a new product, and it just operates slightly differently. Now that makes sense to me, and that's where we are with AES. So that's what we're going to be doing. However, and this is a question to all of us, how do we do ongoing quality assurance of machine learning and its development? Because don't forget, even though you might set it up at the beginning and saying you know exactly how it works, don't forget, as data is being inputted, it is changing all the time. It is learning from its data. What happens if the data that you produced isn't quite what it should be? It's already adapting. What continuous quality checks would you put against the criteria, against specific criteria? What tools would you use? I mean, we use a similar concept for internal quality assurance or other markers such as patient means. That's like, you're monitoring a piece of an instrument because it's dynamic. You got, there's the tubing, there's the probes. You would assess it by that. But how do you sensibly manage this and make the tools fit for purpose? And interestingly enough, nobody has the answer to this one yet. So this is where I think the question is to us and the challenge to ourselves and where we need to get to. So what would we do? How would we assess it? And these are my thoughts. Would we look at clinical outcome? Well, that's interesting in bowel cancer screening because that's not an immediate impact because it takes about 10 years, 10 years for someone sometimes to develop bowel cancer. So me making a decision now, knowing what happens 10 years time is not an appropriate review of what's actually happening. How would you how would you how would you look at the AI machine learning model to quality assurance? How would you be doing it? What tools are available? What does the company use? But we need to develop our own tools because, as you all know, the manufacturers for diagnostic companies will say, well, test X has a CB of 5% for this population at these levels. We then take it into our own hands and we assess it, correct? We say, well, how does it work in our population for us? We still need to do that with AI and machine learning because we cannot just rely on a manufacturer saying, oh, yes, an AI company saying, oh, yes, it will absolutely hit all these clinical targets for you. Your population may be very different. How would you assess drift in performance? As we do an assay that goes off, how do you calibrate it? How do you correct deviations safely? And what governance practices would you use to work with these experts? Because these are governance practices are not in place. How do you ensure it's secure from user changes and safety of the system is very important. What other parameters do we need to consider? And we need to think about the total error of assays when combined with the error rate of the AI, because the software will have its own error rate. But if your assay is suddenly starting to go off, it's compounding that on your software, and you need to understand that impact. And what about external quality insurance? Well, I held discussions with UK NEQAS in Birmingham and said, well, I'm developing this AI. We need to externally validate it because that's what you do with every assay. Think of it as an assay. Can you help us? And they said, well, we need further understanding of the AI scenario because it's so different to what they do. They said they could potentially provide external data sets to assess the outcome of the machine learning, which was useful. But how do you assess the outcome when there's no comparator? When we talk about EQA or proficiency testing, there's a gold standard or there's a number of labs that are running that same assay and you can compare to method means. You are the most unique product out there. How do you know your result is a true result and it's accurate to a gold standard? Who are you comparing to? And there has to be assessment of the timeliness of assessment and ability to work through corrective actions. How do you respond to an EQA review that says that your assay is not working properly or your AI system is not working properly? How far back do you go to reassess whether it's given the right answers? And I think importantly, and I'm sure we all have to consider all these things against things like UCAS accreditation. So how are we assessed against ISO 15189? How does it support safe implementation of AI machine learning? I've seen those standards. It doesn't mention that at all. How would we assess AI machine learning? What expertise would an assessor need to have to assess the AI machine learning with confidence? This is out of their expertise. We need people with expertise to go and assess other people's AI software, or they can just be bamboozled and think it's fantastic. I'm not saying that would happen, but that's it's easy if you don't understand it. How can you really challenge whether the quality and the safety is what it should be? So how would they assess the governance between us and the companies? And what other ISO standards would the laboratory need in place? Would we need some of those ISO standards that I mentioned earlier? There certainly is stuff about data safety, confidentiality, environmental factors that we need to think about. But do we need to start applying them? And we know that accreditation and meeting standards is very onerous and it is quite expensive. How would we build that all in? So I ended up leaving with a question that I think we should think about. What role does a healthcare professional have in artificial intelligence and machine learning in laboratory medicine? I mean, are the robots coming for our jobs? Are the machines coming? Well, in my view, no. We need subject matter experts. I think it's up to us for us to pivot somewhat and spend some time learning and educating ourselves on what is required for AI and machine learning. I think it was interesting, the conversations I had with the company. We were speaking very different language. They had very it was kind of having to describe to each other where we were coming from, and I think there is a need to learn it. And then we have to think about clinical responsibility. As I said earlier, we clearly can see if somebody's put a comment on to do further clinical intervention on a patient with your signature next to it that says you're taking clinical responsibility. What happens if the software itself gives the wrong diagnosis, the wrong risk score? Who takes clinical responsibility? Ultimately, we are the ones that are advocating for its implementation. We are the ones having to assess whether it's doing what it should be doing. Ultimately, the clinical responsibility starts to sit with a human somewhere. And we also have to be the ones that design and manage the governance of AI and machine learning, because those tools do not exist at the moment. There's a lot of information on the internet. We somehow need to pull that together and develop those tools ourselves. So I'm going to summarize now. So what we've got to think about is that the development of AI and machine learning by experts is rapid. They're coming at us at a rate of knots, saying, I've got this product. But you have to be careful. You can't just say, yes, I'm great, I'll take that on. We have to know what it's doing. The regulatory landscape is changing constantly, and so we have to work with it. There are some significant data availability issues causing delays in the development, which means that data may be older than the current state of art knowledge, and it must be of a very high quality. Large funding is required to develop AI and machine learning to ensure the correct governance in place. It takes time and it takes a lot of working through. It must have all stakeholder involvement, so that's clinicians and patients. Importantly, you do need to understand the contractual and IP agreements between laboratories and private companies. They are a company. They want to make a profit. We are in the clinical field trying to prove clinical value in what we are doing, and we have to have explainability, and there's a bit of a conflict there. How do you make sure transparency and explainability of what we call black boxes is really out there? And a lot of publications want to see that explainability. So sometimes you might not get published if you can't explain how your software is getting to the result. You need to develop and understand the regulatory standards, and we importantly need to develop the quality assurance criteria and the tools. So I just want to say thank you to all of these people: Steve Smith, who was a consultant scientist with us, Kerry and head of R&D, and Guy, who actually helped us and sat with us to do the contractual discussions, and Shiwan, who was our statistician, and then the people from AES and Ethos, who helped us with the regulatory approvals, and from funding from Innovate UK and NIHR. Thank you for listening.